When he said, "I never loved you," and then begged for me back after I won the lottery, I realized that karma sometimes needs a little help from human hands. The numbers are still burned into my memory like a brand: 7, 14, 23, 31, 42, 48. 6 little digits that changed everything. But before I tell you about the money, before I tell you about the sweet, cold revenge that followed, I need to take you back to that Tuesday morning when my world imploded. I was making coffee in our kitchen, though I suppose it was never really our kitchen, was it? When I heard his voice drifting from the bedroom. He was on the phone, and something about his tone made my hand freeze on the coffee pot handle. There was an intimacy there, a softness I hadn't heard directed at me in months. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, masking my footsteps as I crept closer to the bedroom door. My heart was already racing, that sick anticipation you get when you know you're about to discover something that will hurt you, but you can't stop yourself from looking. His voice was clearer now, and the words hit me like physical blows. He was telling someone, her, I realized with crystal clarity, that he'd never really loved me. That I was convenient, that I paid half the bills and didn't ask too many questions. That he was only staying until he figured out his next move. The coffee pot shattered when it hit the kitchen floor. He came running, phone hastily shoved into his pocket, concern painted across his face like stage makeup. The same face I'd kissed goodbye every morning for 3 years. The same mouth that had whispered promises and shared secrets and apparently never meant a single word. I stood there in the puddle of glass and coffee, watching him perform this charade of caring, and felt something inside me crystallize into ice. He was asking if I was okay, reaching for me, and all I could think was how convincing he looked. How practiced. I told him I was fine, that I'd just been clumsy. The lie tasted bitter on my tongue, but it was nothing compared to the poison I'd just swallowed overhearing his truth. He helped me clean up the mess, his hands gentle and familiar, and I wanted to scream. Instead, I smiled and thanked him and went to work like it was any other day. But it wasn't any other day. It was the day I learned that my entire relationship was a performance, and I'd been the only one who didn't know I was acting. The next few weeks passed in a strange, suspended animation. I went through the motions of our life together while planning my exit strategy. I couldn't confront him, not yet. I needed time to process, to plan, to figure out how to disentangle my life from someone who'd never actually been tangled up with me at all. I started looking at apartments online during my lunch breaks. I calculated how much money I'd need to make a clean break. I practiced conversations in my head, imagining different ways to end things with dignity and tact. I thought I was being so strategic, so mature. Then I bought that lottery ticket. It wasn't planned or meaningful, just a moment of impulse at the grocery store checkout. $5 for a fantasy, I thought. $5 to imagine a life where money wasn't the chain keeping me bound to a man who saw me as nothing more than a convenient roommate with benefits. 3 days later, I was a multimillionaire. I checked the numbers 7 times before I believed it. Sitting in my car in the grocery store parking lot, hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone, I verified each digit against the winning combination. 7, 14, 23, 31, 42, 48. $43 million after taxes. 43 million reasons why everything was about to change. The smart thing would have been to tell him immediately. We weren't married, but we'd been living together long enough that he might have some claim to the money depending on how things played out legally. The decent thing would have been to share the windfall with someone I'd supposedly loved, but he'd never loved me. He'd made that crystal clear. So instead, I drove home in a daze, the winning ticket burning a hole in my purse like a secret weapon. He was there when I got back, sprawled on the couch watching television, and he looked up at me with that casual affection that I now knew was completely hollow. He asked about my day. I told him it was fine, nothing special. The lie came so easily it scared me. That night, lying next to him in bed, listening to him breathe, I stared at the ceiling and felt my heartbreak transform into something colder and infinitely more dangerous. He'd played a long game with me, keeping me around for convenience while planning his escape. Well, 2 could play that game, and I had $43 million to play with. I called in sick to work the next morning after he left. I needed time to think, to plan, to figure out exactly how I wanted this to unfold. The money was real. I'd verified it with the lottery commission, started the claim process, arranged for financial advisors and lawyers. But more than that, it was leverage. For the first time in weeks, I felt powerful. I started researching him. Really researching him, not just accepting the version of himself he'd presented to me. Social media deep dives, public records searches, anything I could find that might give me insight into who he really was beneath the mask he wore at home. What I found was illuminating and infuriating in equal measure. The woman he'd been talking to on the phone wasn't some random fling. She was his ex-girlfriend from college, the one he'd told me had been crazy and clingy. According to her social media, they'd been in regular contact for months. Months of conversations and meetings and emotional intimacy that he'd been hiding from me while sharing my bed and eating food I'd paid for. But it got worse. Much worse. There were others. A dating profile he'd kept active with photos I recognized from our vacations together. Photos where he'd carefully cropped me out. Messages to other women describing himself as single, looking for something real, tired of meaningless relationships. I was the meaningless relationship. Sitting in my home office, scrolling through evidence of his systematic betrayal, I felt that ice in my chest spread outward until it reached my fingertips. He'd been auditioning my replacements while lying next to me every night. He'd been building exit ramps while I'd been planning a future. The funny thing about winning the lottery is that everyone assumes it's pure good fortune. Random chance. Luck of the draw. But sitting there with all his lies spread out before me on my computer screen, I started to think that maybe the universe has a sense of timing after all. Maybe I won that money precisely when I needed the power to balance the scales. I spent the next few days in a strange state of hyper-awareness. Every interaction with him became a study in deception. I watched him lie to me about where he'd been, who he'd talked to, what he was thinking. I listened to him make plans for our future together, while knowing he was actively working to build a future without me. And through it all, he had no idea that I knew. No idea that I was sitting on enough money to change both our lives forever. No idea that I was watching him with the cold fascination of a scientist observing a particularly interesting specimen. He thought he was so clever, so careful with his deceptions. But he'd gotten comfortable, lazy even. He left his phone unlocked when he showered. He forgot to delete browser histories. He assumed I was too trusting, too naive, too dependent on him to look too closely at the inconsistencies in his stories. He was right about the trusting part, at least until that Tuesday morning when I'd heard him reveal his true feelings to someone else. But he was dead wrong about the naive and dependent parts. I started planning my revenge with the same methodical care he'd put into planning his betrayal. But where his plan was cruel and cowardly, mine would be public and devastating. Where his was designed to leave me broken and discarded, mine was designed to give him exactly what he deserved. I hired a private investigator to document his cheating. Not because I needed more evidence, I had plenty, but because I wanted professional documentation. Photos, recordings, timestamps. I wanted a complete picture of his double life, meticulously cataloged and impossible to deny. I also hired a lawyer, not for the lottery money, but to make sure I understood exactly what I could and couldn't do legally in terms of exposing his behavior. I wasn't interested in breaking the law for revenge, but I was very interested in finding the boundaries of what I could accomplish within it. The hardest part was continuing to live with him while I knew the truth. Sitting across from him at dinner while he asked about my day, all the while planning to see another woman later that night. Listening to him make suggestions for weekend plans when I knew he was hoping to spend those weekends with someone else. But it also gave me time to study him, to understand the full scope of his selfishness and manipulation. I started seeing patterns I'd missed before, how he'd isolate me from friends by creating subtle conflicts, how he'd undermine my confidence with backhanded compliments, how he'd trained me to prioritize his needs over my own. He hadn't just been cheating on me sexually and emotionally. He'd been psychologically manipulating me to make me easier to control and eventually discard. That realization was like adding gasoline to the fire of my anger. 3 weeks after winning the lottery, I was ready to make my move. I'd claimed the money, set up accounts, arranged for security, and most importantly, I'd crafted the perfect plan for revealing his true nature to the world. But first, I wanted to give him one last chance to be honest with me. Call it a final test, or maybe just my own way of making sure I could live with what I was about to do. I planned it for a Friday evening. He'd been particularly attentive that week, probably sensing that I'd been distant and trying to smooth things over before his weekend plans with other women. We were having dinner at home, Chinese takeout and wine, and the atmosphere was almost cozy. Almost like we were actually in love. I asked him directly if there was anything he wanted to tell me. Anything about our relationship that we should discuss. I gave him every opening I could think of, short of revealing that I knew about his cheating. He looked me straight in the eye and told me he'd never been happier. Said he loved me more than he'd ever loved anyone. Talked about our future together, about trips we should take and goals we should set. Every word was a lie, delivered with perfect sincerity. That night, after he fell asleep, I finalized my plans. The time for mercy had passed. The Lottery Commission was holding a press conference the following Wednesday to announce the winner. Standard procedure for jackpots this size. They like the publicity, and most winners are happy to play along for their 15 minutes of fame. I'd initially planned to decline the media attention, to claim my money quietly and disappear. But now I saw an opportunity for something much more satisfying. I would go public with my win. I would stand in front of cameras and reporters and tell my story. And I would make sure that everyone who mattered to him, his family, his friends, his co-workers, and especially his secret girlfriend, knew exactly what kind of man he really was. But that wasn't all. I had something much more personal planned for him. On Monday morning, I told him I had a surprise for him. Something special I'd been planning. His eyes lit up with genuine excitement, and for a moment I felt a flicker of the old pain. This was the man I'd fallen in love with, the charming, enthusiastic person he could be when he wanted something. I told him to meet me at our favorite restaurant Friday evening. Somewhere special, I said. Somewhere we could talk about our future. He was so pleased, so eager. He even suggested he might have a surprise for me too, something he'd been thinking about for a while. I wondered if he was planning to break up with me then, or if he was going to propose marriage as a way to secure access to whatever windfall he might suspect I'd come into. It didn't matter. Either way, he was in for the shock of his life. Tuesday, I submitted my resignation at work, effective immediately. I'd been there for 5 years, and my boss was surprised but understanding. I told her I'd come into some money and wanted to take time to figure out my next steps. She wished me well and promised to give me glowing references whenever I needed them. Wednesday was the press conference. I wore my best dress, did my hair and makeup with extra care, and stood before a crowd of reporters and cameras to claim my $43 million. They asked the usual questions. How did I feel? What were my plans? Had it sunk in yet? I answered with poise and grace, playing the part of the grateful, overwhelmed winner. But then a reporter asked if I planned to share my good fortune with anyone special. I smiled directly into the camera and said I was looking forward to sharing my blessing with the people who truly deserved it. The people who had shown me real love and loyalty. The answer was technically true, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Thursday, I spent the day moving my belongings out of our apartment while he was at work. Not everything. I didn't want him to know I was leaving yet. Just the important things, the items with sentimental value, and anything I couldn't bear to lose. I also left something behind. A manila envelope on his pillow with copies of everything I'd discovered about his cheating. Photos, messages, timeline, all of it laid out in chronological order. But I included a note saying I wouldn't confront him about it yet, that I wanted to give him one last chance to be honest with me at dinner on Friday. It was a lie, of course. I had no intention of giving him any chances, but I wanted him to spend Thursday night panicking, trying to figure out how much I knew and what I might do about it. I wanted him to experience just a taste of the uncertainty and fear he'd put me through. Friday morning, he called me 7 times. I didn't answer. He sent increasingly frantic text messages asking where I was, saying we needed to talk, begging me to call him back. I responded once around noon. See you at dinner? We'll talk then. I spent Friday afternoon at a spa, getting a massage and facial, having my nails done. I wanted to look absolutely perfect for what was coming. This was my moment. My chance to reclaim my power and dignity, and I wasn't going to waste it. At 5 o'clock, I put on my most elegant dress, the black one he'd always said was his favorite, and drove to the restaurant. I'd made reservations for 2, requested a quiet corner table, told them it was a special occasion. It was, just not in the way they assumed. He was already there when I arrived, sitting hunched over his phone, looking haggard and desperate. When he saw me, relief flooded his face, followed quickly by guilt and fear. He stood up too fast, knocking over his water glass, and I watched him scramble to clean it up while the waiter rushed over to help. Even in his panic, he was still performing, still trying to manage appearances and control the narrative. I sat down across from him with perfect composure and ordered a glass of champagne. He stared at me like I was a stranger, which I suppose I was. The woman he'd been living with for 3 years was gone. In her place sat someone who knew exactly who he was and what he'd done. He started talking immediately, words tumbling over each other in his desperation to explain. He told me the cheating didn't mean anything, that he'd been confused and scared about our relationship, that he'd made terrible mistakes but had realized he couldn't live without me. I let him talk. I sipped my champagne and watched him grovel and perform and lie some more. Even now, even caught red-handed, he couldn't bring himself to tell me the complete truth. He didn't know about the lottery win yet. The press conference had aired on a small local channel, and apparently he'd been too distracted by my discovery of his cheating to pay attention to any news. So he was working from incomplete information, trying to salvage a relationship he'd never valued in the first place. When he finally ran out of steam, I set down my champagne glass and smiled at him. Really smiled, with genuine warmth and amusement. He looked confused, hopeful, like maybe his performance had worked. That's when I told him about the lottery. I watched his face transform as the implications hit him. First confusion, then understanding, then desperate calculation. I could practically see him recalibrating his approach, trying to figure out how to position himself for maximum benefit from this new information. He reached across the table for my hand, his eyes filling with tears that might even have been real. He told me he loved me, that he'd always loved me, that money didn't matter to him, but our relationship was everything. I let him hold my hand while he lied to my face one more time. Then I gently pulled away and told him I had something to show him. I took out my phone and played a recording I'd made earlier that day. It was a compilation of all his lies, the phone call I'd overheard that first Tuesday morning, audio recordings from the private investigator, voicemails he'd left for other women. His own voice, clear and undeniable, telling multiple people that he'd never loved me, that I was just convenient, that he was using me until something better came along. The blood drained from his face as he listened. Other diners were starting to stare as his voice carried from my phone speakers, but I didn't lower the volume. Let them hear. Let everyone know what kind of man he really was. When the recording ended, I leaned forward and spoke quietly, intimately, like I was sharing a romantic secret. I told him that I'd known about his cheating for weeks, that I'd been watching him lie to me every single day while planning his escape from our relationship, that I'd used that time to plan my own escape and my revenge. I told him about the private investigator, about the documentation of his affairs, about the lawyer I'd hired to make sure I could share all that information without legal consequences. I told him that copies of everything, photos, recordings, timeline, evidence of his systematic manipulation and emotional abuse, had been sent to his parents, his siblings, his boss, his friends, and every woman he'd been cheating with. I told him that I'd also sent everything to the local newspaper, along with a statement about how winning the lottery had given me the resources and freedom to expose the kind of man who preys on women's trust and kindness. I told him that his story would be running in Sunday's paper, complete with photos and a detailed timeline of his deceptions. But most importantly, I told him that I'd never loved him either. That was a lie, but it was the kind of lie that felt like justice. He sat there in stunned silence as I stood up, left money on the table for my champagne, and walked out of the restaurant. Behind me, I could hear him starting to panic, calling my name, probably causing a scene. I didn't look back. Outside in the parking lot, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get my car keys out of my purse. The adrenaline was incredible. I felt like I could fly or fight or do anything at all. For the first time in months, I felt completely, utterly free. My phone started ringing before I even got home. Him, over and over, calling and texting and leaving increasingly desperate voicemails. I turned it off and drove to my new apartment, a luxury high-rise downtown that I'd rented with cash, far from anywhere he might think to look for me. Saturday morning, I woke up to silence. No one in the bed next to me, no one expecting breakfast or conversation or emotional labor. Just me, sunlight streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows, and the knowledge that I'd taken back my power in the most spectacular way possible. The story ran in Sunday's paper as promised, a full page in the lifestyle section, complete with photos from our social media accounts and a detailed timeline of his deceptions. The headline read, "Lottery winner exposes cheating boyfriend's web of lies." It was perfect. By Monday, the story had been picked up by several online publications. By Tuesday, it was trending on social media. By Wednesday, I was getting interview requests from television shows and magazines. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive. Women shared their own stories of betrayal and manipulation. Men condemned his behavior and praised me for refusing to stay silent. Everyone seemed to understand that this wasn't just about cheating. It was about the systematic way he'd undermined my reality and sense of self-worth. I gave one television interview on a popular morning show. I wore a simple but elegant dress, spoke calmly and clearly about emotional manipulation and the importance of believing in your own worth, and donated a significant portion of my lottery winnings to organizations that support women leaving abusive relationships. I never mentioned his name during the interview, but I didn't need to. Everyone already knew who I was talking about. The aftermath was everything I'd hoped for and more. His employer, a conservative financial firm that prized their reputation, quietly let him go. His family cut contact after seeing the full scope of his deceptions. His friends distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with someone who'd been publicly exposed as a manipulative liar. Most satisfying of all, the women he'd been cheating with not only rejected him completely, but several of them reached out to me with their own stories of his manipulation and emotional abuse. It turned out his pattern of behavior was even more extensive than I'd realized. He tried to contact me for months afterward. Phone calls, emails, letters, messages through mutual acquaintances. He alternated between begging for forgiveness and demanding I retract my lies about him. He threatened to sue me for defamation, but my lawyer had been very careful about the legal boundaries of what I could reveal. Everything I'd shared was true and documented. There was nothing he could do about it. The truth, as it turned out, was the most devastating weapon of all. A year later, I was living in a beautiful house in the mountains, pursuing a master's degree in psychology, and volunteering with organizations that help women recognize and escape emotional manipulation. I'd used my lottery platform to become an advocate for others who'd experienced what I had, and I'd found purpose in that work that was more fulfilling than any job I'd ever had. I'd also met someone new. Someone who was honest and kind and actually capable of love. Someone who knew my whole story and admired my strength rather than trying to undermine it. But the most important relationship I'd rebuilt was the one with myself. The woman who'd stood in that kitchen listening to her boyfriend reveal his true feelings was gone. In her place was someone who knew her own worth, who wouldn't accept crumbs of affection from someone incapable of real love, who understood that sometimes the universe gives you exactly the tools you need to balance the scales. I never did find out what his surprise for me was going to be that Friday night. Part of me suspected he'd been planning to propose, not out of love, but as a way to secure legal access to whatever money he might have suspected I'd come into. If that was his plan, the irony was exquisite. He'd intended to use marriage as a trap to keep me bound to him while he continued his deceptions. Instead, my freedom from him had been the key to everything that followed. Sometimes I wondered if I'd been too harsh, if public humiliation had been a disproportionate response to his betrayal. But then I'd remember the systematic nature of his deceptions, the way he'd undermined my reality and sense of self-worth, the coldness in his voice when he'd told someone else he'd never loved me. And I'd remember that he'd never actually apologized for hurting me. Even in that final restaurant confrontation, even when caught red-handed, he'd only been sorry that he'd been discovered. He'd been calculating how to minimize his losses and maximize his gains from my lottery win. He'd never once considered how his actions had affected me as a human being. That's when I knew I'd done exactly what needed to be done. The lottery ticket had given me financial freedom, but the revenge had given me something far more valuable, the absolute certainty that I deserved better than someone who could look me in the eye and lie without flinching. These days, when people ask me about winning the lottery, I tell them the money was just the beginning. The real jackpot was learning to value myself enough to walk away from someone who didn't deserve me. And when they ask if I have any regrets about how things ended, I smile and tell them the truth. Sometimes the universe gives you exactly what you need, exactly when you need it, even if you have to buy the winning ticket yourself.